Hi, everybody. I'm Jenny from Beaverton City Library. Today, we're going to be learning about beginning beekeeping from Mandy Shaw from the Portland Urban Beekeepers. And Mandy is also, she also has a podcast called Beekeeper Confidential. So check it out. All right, over to you, Mandy.
Hi, thank you. I know that we have a bit of a time limit today, and so there's a lot of information that I'm going to be sharing with you. So I'm going to run through some of it pretty fast, but you can always go back and watch it. That's the beauty of having this pre-recorded. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now and get the presentation up. All right. This is the Beekeeping 101 course that I usually teach, just with my few minor adjustments. These are some of the places where I keep bees. I have a farm in West Lynn that I keep some bees at, a rooftop in Southeast Portland where I keep some bees, and then also my backyard here in Beaverton. So you can really keep bees in a lot of different environments. Let's start with some simple vocabulary terms. Beekeeping has its own language, but these are some of the common terms that we like to use. When we talk about hives and colonies, the hive is actually the cavity that the bees are living within, and the colony is the family of bees that are living in the hive. Wax or drawn comb is something that bees make themselves, and it's like their furniture. They live on it, they grow baby bees in it, they use it for food storage. And here's a little video of bees constructing comb. They have these glands in their abdomen that secrete little wax flakes, and what they do is they gather up in a little ball and they excrete the flakes of wax, and they pass them upwards and they shape them with their mandibles into these wonderful, very, very pure, clean combs of wax. And then over time, as it gets used, the wax darkens. But it's a really fascinating process to watch. Pollen and bee bread. Bee bread is basically pollen that has been fermented. The bees will add bits of water and honey to it, and it ferments, and they use this to feed the larva as it's developing. It's a protein source for them as they're developing into adult bees. Brood is what we use to describe the baby bees. Of course, they start as an egg, and then the egg hatches and turns into a larva. And right when the larva is ready to begin its pupation, the adult bees, the nurse bees that take care of the young, will put a little wax capping over top of that so it can complete its pupation into an adult bee. And the photo on the left shows a nice example of what those cappings look like. So you have a full sheet of pupating bees right there. Honey, there's uncapped honey and capped honey. So when the nectar is brought back to the hive, it's really wet. And so the bees will store it in the honeycomb, and they go through a process of drying it or curing it. And when it reaches the right moisture content, which is off the top of my head, under 17% moisture, they will put a wax capping over it. And then it's pure honey forever. It's clean and it doesn't ferment. If a beekeeper were to harvest the honey too soon, when it still had a higher moisture content, it will probably ferment and not be good to eat. Propolis is another really important thing that bees will gather. They go around and collect resins from plants and trees, and they use it in their hive to seal up cracks or any little gaps or to smooth down surfaces. But it's also their medicine. It's an antimicrobial, antibacterial thing, and the more they have in their hive, the healthier they're going to be. So when we look inside of a beehive, we're going to have three different kinds of bees. There's the drone bee, which is the male bee. There's the queen. Generally, there's only one queen per hive. There are rare exceptions to that, but generally there's just the one, and she's the mother to all the bees in the hive. And then we have the worker, and the workers are the ones that are really, there are more workers in the hive than any other bee. The queens only take 16 days to develop, which is really quite fast. They will mate with over a dozen drones. It's even been said that they may mate with up to 100 drones when they go out for their mating flight. Their lifespan is about 5 years, which is longer than any of the other bees in the hive. And during peak population, where we're at right about now in our season, they're laying about 2,000 eggs a day. She's not in charge. That's a big misconception because she has the title of the queen, but she's actually not in charge. It's the worker bees that make the decisions for the hive. And the worker bees can replace their queen if they feel like she's not doing a well enough job, or if they decide they want to have a swarm, they can create new queens. Here's some examples of different queen bees. They all have different colorings and different markings on them. They can be tricky to spot at first, but once you get used to it, you sort of get a feel for where she's going to be, and they will get easier to find. Here's a little video of a brand new queen bee, and you can see how the other bees sort of get out of the way as she comes walking through. She emits a pheromone that the other bees find very exciting. And they'll go where she goes. The drone bees are the bees in the hive that take the longest to develop from egg to adult, 24 full days. They're pretty big. A lot of new beekeepers will mistake a drone bee for their queen bee because they're similar in size. When a drone bee mates, they die. That is their one purpose. They don't participate in any of the foraging. They don't participate in any of the hive maintenance. Their sole purpose is to go out and mate with a queen. So every day they will go out and look for a queen. They go to a place called a drone congregation area where hundreds of drones from different hives in the area will meet and fly around and wait for a queen. And when a queen comes by, they will chase after her and hope that they're fast enough to catch her to mate with her. They also don't have a stinger, so you can get used to handling bees by picking up drones and playing with them, but be sure you know it's a drone before you just pick up a random bee. Here's some other images of drones. They have these wonderful big eyes that touch up in the center. They have 2 eyes, whereas the other bees in the hive have 3 eyes, or 5 eyes, excuse me. Here's a little video of the drone flying. I love his big dangly legs. Right. The worker bees are really the bees that are running the show. They take care of nearly every essential function in the hive. They take care of the brood, they take care of food storage and processing, they take care of cleaning, protecting the hive, and ultimately going out and foraging for food, water, and a new place to live if they decide that they need to move. During the summer and spring, their lifespan is very short. It's only about 6 weeks, and that's because they work themselves to death. In the wintertime and late fall, those bees, they have to live a little bit longer. They have to last longer so that they can make it through the winter. And those are called the fat winter bees. They have higher fat content in their bodies than the summertime bees do. A successful beehive should have about 60,000 bees or worker bees in it at peak of their season. That's a lot of bees. And when you open a hive, this is what you will find. You look down into it and there's all these little worker bee faces peering up at you. One of the most fascinating things that the worker bees do is the waggle dance. And it's a way for them to communicate a few bits of information. The location of a food source or water or a new home, but they also tell you how far away from the hive it is, and also the direction that it is in correlation with where the sun is at in the sky at that time. So it's a really, really sophisticated form of communication, especially for an insect. And I just think it's very fascinating. She must have found something really good. She seems very excited. So there's different kinds of hives that bees live in. Their most optimum hive is a bee tree. Basically, it's a tree with a hollow in it, and the bees, they've lived in those for centuries, and that's what's the most ideal home for them. It has really high insulation value, which is something that man-made hives don't offer bees. They also promote this inner ecosystem that that is beneficial to the bees. And it's becoming a more popular idea among urban beekeepers and conservationists who want to basically rewild the honeybee population, put them back into nature, back into tree hollows where they once came from. And I'm lucky enough to have one of these in my backyard, so I get to observe them year after year, untouched by a beekeeper, and it's really, really an enjoyable process. Here's a little video. So they've used propolis to coat part of the outside of their entrance there. The entrance to their little hive is about the size of a softball, so it's pretty big. I think it's a really wonderful experience to be able to keep bees in this way, to see how they interact with the environment and interact with their hive without any management or manipulation from the beekeeper. This is looking down into it from the top, and you can see where they've started building combs, and they've got propolis up along the sides. They're just happy little bees living their bee life. Okay. Langstroth hives are the most common beehive that beekeepers in America keep their bees in. It's the rectangular box that you have the frames that you pull out. This is the most economical hive to use. It's the simplest hive to learn how to keep bees with. And it's definitely the most readily available kind of hive for beekeepers to get. There are some downsides to it. The boxes can become extremely heavy, especially later in the season as they fill up with honey. And when you do an inspection, you have to pull the whole hive apart, which can be disruptive for the bees, but also it's a lot of heavy lifting. I can't tell you how many times I've injured my back working with Langstroth hives. But here's some examples of what a frame of bees looks like. In the center, these are really, really great examples of brood frames. So that's a really healthy looking hive. On the right-hand side, those are bees that are building new wax on a blank frame. So they've all sort of gathered up in a little ball, in a little chain there at the bottom, and they measure the space. And so as they build the comb, they will just continue to grow it out to the point where it fills up the entire frame. Sometimes, though, they don't build the comb straight or narrow enough. on each individual frame. And so this is called cross comb, and it happens a lot. So here's a couple of examples of what that can look like. And it can make it really difficult to pull those frames out of the hive without breaking the combs or spilling honey everywhere. So it's a little tricky sometimes. Top bar hives are another really wonderful hive design that I like to use. My number one favorite thing about them is there's no heavy lifting because the hives are totally horizontal. You can make these. There's lots of different plans online on how to make top bar hives. Here's some more pictures of those. Mine have windows in them, so if you purchase one or make one on your own, being able to have a window is a really wonderful way to monitor your bees without opening up the colony and disturbing them. You can watch their comb growth, you could see which combs they're living on the most, and it's just fun, especially if you have people over. It's fun to do a little show and tell with the bee window. But another really nice thing about working with these top bar hives is when you want to do an inspection, you can do that minimally disrupting the colony because you don't have these boxes that you're taking apart. It's just a simple frame by frame and scooting them down as you go. They are also very prone to getting cross comb or where the combs aren't built perfectly straight. So here's an example of that. It's a little bit easier to deal with in these hives than it is with the Langstroth hive. Warre hives are another popular design, especially for natural beekeeping. These are hives that you really can't do a lot of inspection with because the bees will attach their combs to the sides of the boxes. But here's some examples. This is a really well drawn out frame or box of Warre combs, but sometimes they'll draw them out like that. Even with guides that you can put in the hive to sort of try and encourage them to draw them out straight, sometimes they'll make them really crooked. And so when they're like this, you can't really go in and inspect without making a giant mess. There's different ways to get bees. Most people will start by purchasing a nucleus colony or a nuke. It's basically a miniature hive. You get 4 or 5 frames of bees with a queen that they're established with. There will be brood, honey, and pollen on those frames. And it's a pretty easy way to start a new hive. Another way is to buy a package of bees. Packages are a little bit trickier because when you get the bees, they have a queen that's brand new to them. So they haven't gotten used to her yet. And so there's a chance that they might reject her. But they also don't come with those frames of brood or honey or pollen. So they really are starting from scratch. So they need a little bit of extra care up front to help them get established. You can catch a swarm, which is one of my favorite things to do as a beekeeper. And if you ask any beekeeper, swarm catching is probably really high up there on their favorite parts of being a beekeeper. Swarms happen when a colony has survived the winter and they're healthy and they have enough bees that they are ready to spread their genetics by dividing their home hive. And the old queen leaves with about half of the bees and they go out to find and establish a new hive. And so what's left behind is a brand new queen to take over and the rest of the worker bees. You can also put up bait hives for like little boxes up in trees that swarms can find and move into. This is also a really fun activity. It's sort of luck of the draw because you never know what's going to happen, but I've had very good success with this in Beaverton. So yeah, I always end up getting some bees with bait hives or swarms each year. You can also split a colony. So if you have bees that survived the winter, you can sort of catch them before they go into that swarming mindset, and you can split them by removing the queen and frames of brood and eggs and just starting a new colony. You can, I wouldn't recommend this for a brand new beekeeper because it's really a difficult job, but sometimes bees move into places where they shouldn't be. This is an example of what a cutout would look like. These were bees that were living in the wall of a house, and they had been there for several years. The house was slated for demolition, and so they called me to come in and remove the colony. And it's really, really hard work, and it's really stressful on the bees, but that is one way to get bees. You'll need to get a lot of equipment to get started with bees. You'll want to have some protective clothing, especially as you're getting used to working with bees. I know some beekeepers that, they'll wear a veil and their street clothes and then that's it. But I do recommend, at the very least, a veil, some gloves. You can use leather or nitrile gloves, hive tool, the smoker. You'll want to get a first aid kit, especially if you're not really familiar with how you react to stings. I carry a Benadryl packet and EpiPens in my first aid kit just to be on the safe side. Always have some water because you get really hot working with your bees in the full suit, and then a mite testing kit. And we'll get into mites in just a little bit. There's a lot to consider when you're setting up your apiary. Your apiary is basically where you have your bees. OSU Extension Services just put out a really wonderful publication called the Residential Beekeeping Guidelines, and it lists a lot of best practices that they've determined working with the Department of Agriculture and the Extension Service at OSU. And that's available on their website. It's free. You can download it as a PDF, and it has a lot of this information in it. So beekeeping and pests and parasites go hand in hand. And that's why I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about this today. The number one challenge with keeping bees, and not just for commercial beekeepers, it's for urban beekeepers as well, is the varroa mite. This is a pest or a parasite that can decimate a healthy colony in a matter of weeks. The challenge to managing these mites is that they're very hard to see. They're really small, and they embed themselves under the abdominal plates on the bees, and then they feed off of their liver. So the picture in the upper right, you can see the varroa mite just sort of lodged in there under that abdominal plate. And so doing a visual inspection, looking for these things, it's not very effective because of where they like to hide. They also reproduce under the brood. So while the bee is going through their pupation, the varroa mite has climbed in and has started laying eggs, and her offspring will reproduce while the bee is pupating. And that causes a number of problems. Here's some examples. These are photos that I took with my microscope just to show how difficult they are to see with the naked eye. On the picture on the left, you can see an adult varroa up along the side of the cell to the left. A little more towards the right, you can see their really young offspring. And those offspring are highlighted again in the picture on the right. So one varroa mite can go into a cell. You might get 3 or 4 climbing out of the cell with it. And then they repeat this process throughout the year. So even at the beginning of a season, a colony might not have very many mites, but as the mites continue to reproduce in the bees' brood cycles, their numbers can accelerate very, very quickly. And this is some of the damage that the varroa mites can cause. They vector viruses. They cause the bees to become really weak and sick. They cause the brood pattern to break down. And in the center here, these are bees that have something called deformed wing virus, and this is caused by varroa mites. The bees will never be able to contribute to the health or vitality of the colony because they were born with shriveled up wings, they're sick, and it's just once a colony gets to that point where you're seeing a lot of that, it's very hard to correct it. And then on the far right, those are varroa mites that are on the little tray underneath the beehive. A lot of beehives have little trays underneath them that you can pull out to look for varroa. So there's quite a lot there. Wax moths are another pest. They're more of nature's cleanup crew because they eat wax. So if a colony dies, or let's say they have too much space, the wax moths will be attracted to the smell of the wax, and they'll come in and they'll eat it and break it down. And it makes a really big mess. But if you think back to bee trees, wax does get really old and it becomes unusable at some point. So the wax moths are there to go in and clean it out so a new colony of bees can come in and build new wax. So they're pesty, but they do have an important job. Yellow jackets are also an issue for bees. They like to eat bees. And if a colony is weak, if they can't protect their entrance, yellow jackets can go in and start stealing brood. They could steal honey. And if the colony is weak enough, yellow jackets can kill them. So if you have bees, you will have yellow jackets visiting your yard. Honeybees can also be predators to other honeybees, especially as we get closer to fall and winter when we run out of nectar sources. They will rob honey from each other. So if you have again, like a colony that's sick or unable to protect their hive entrance, other honeybees can come in and steal honey from them. And on the little tray that I just mentioned a few moments ago, if you see legs and wings and all these shredded bits of wax, that's definitely a hive that's being robbed, and that's the result of fighting, and the shredded wax cappings are from capped honey that the robbers have pulled open really quick and stolen the honey and gotten out of there. Mice will also try to move into beehives, especially in the winter, because it's a really warm place to be. There's stuff to snack on, and they're cute, but they really make a mess in beehives. So there's things you could put guards on your hive that the bees can fit through, but the mice can't. Small hive beetles are another pest. They don't hurt the bees. They're more a symptom of a hive that's in a space that's too big for them to manage. And it's interesting because when I first started keeping bees, I was taught that in Oregon, we really didn't have very many hive beetles. But the last 3 years, it's becoming more and more common. I see them in my hives once in a while, and I've got several beekeeper friends who have seen them. So it is probably part bringing in bees from out of state for, people when they're buying nucleus colonies. Those are bees that have been down to California. So those may have hive beetles in them, but also as our climate continues to become warmer and warmer, it's easier for these hive beetles to reproduce and spread. Ants, they like to live in beehives. It's warm, there's food right there. They don't really do anything to hurt the bees, but if you open up a beehive that has an ant nest in it, the bees react very, very strongly and very negatively. So for management, each time of the year, your bees are going to have different needs. And so learning to anticipate those needs and prepare for them will help you to be a better beekeeper. Springtime, I just think of it as the glory days of the bee season because the bees are really easy to work with. There's usually a good resource, like the maypole is a really good source of nectar for them. That's the first really big nectar flow that we have in our area. They're expanding, they're swarming. It's just a really fun time to work with the bees. Summer is where we're at now. We've just passed the main nectar flow for the year. And so what they have as far as honey stores and population, that's going to be it, what they have to work with for the rest of the year. This is also when mites, those varroa mite numbers start to really take hold of a colony. So I encourage people to really learn how to test for those and learn what treatment options are available. The Be Informed Partnership at beinformed.org has amazing resources on how to take care of your colonies and monitor for mites and how to treat them. Fall is not as much fun to work with the bees because they are more defensive, because they are really protective of the resources that they have. And that's also when they're experiencing the most agitation from yellow jackets, from robbers, and not as much food is available for them to forage. And so that can also cause them to become cranky. They get hangry too, just like humans do. And this is also a very critical time for them because this is when they start raising those winter bees that have to last all winter long. And so it's very important that the bees have enough adequate nutrition so that they can raise healthy larvae that will grow up to be those fat winter bees. Winter, it's a tough time. Here in Oregon, our average overwinter loss rate is about 40%. So that means about 40% of our bee colonies die every winter across the state of Oregon, which is pretty significant. So if you're a new beekeeper and you have one hive, it's not likely that they're going to make it. If you have two colonies, one of them might survive. It's easier if you have more than one hive to work with. It just helps to increase your chances that you'll have some bees coming out of winter. Starvation and moisture are really big challenges, especially here because our winters are so wet, and also because our winters are generally pretty mild. They're mild enough that the bees are still, in their hive, moving around, eating up all of the food that they've stored up during the year. And so oftentimes you'll have to give them some sort of supplemental food, dry sugar, fondant, just to help them from starving out during the winter months. So when you go in to do a hive inspection, always have a plan, but also be prepared to change that plan because bees, they're full of surprises. And even all the years that I've worked with them, there's still so much to learn because you might think one thing is going to happen and they will do something completely different. It's really important when you're working with the bees just to take your time and go slowly. There's no reason to hurry. They can tell if you're nervous, they can tell if you're rushed, but if you're gentle and calm, they'll be much nicer for you. The smoker is probably one of the most iconic beekeeper symbols that comes to mind. The smoke is used to mask pheromones. So bees do produce a lot of different pheromones for different reasons, but the alarm pheromone is the one that can cause the bees to become aggressive when you're working with them. So the smoke is really handy and just masking that smell so that they will just not get scared, and if they do, they won't be able to spread that frightened message to the rest of their colony. It can also be used to just move them out of the way. So if you have a frame that you need to grab that has all bees all over the top of it, you could just do a few poofs of smoke on it and they'll move out of the way, and then you can take out your frame without smashing anybody. So it's a cool tool, it's useful. Yeah. Here's some more examples of inside the hive. Here's another photo with eggs and some larvae. And then on the left, there's a queen bee in there, along with some drone bees and some worker bees. This queen in particular, she's actually a pretty small one. She's in the very center, and she's a really, really dark abdomen, that you can see. Her head is a little bit hidden, but I hope you guys can see that. Here's some more brood, or the capped brood that we talked about earlier. These are really healthy colonies that have nice, healthy brood. That's what you want when you open a hive, is to see the healthy brood. And you can see the hatch pattern. So when the queen is laying eggs, you want her to start in the center of the frame and work her way out. And when you look at the hatch pattern, you can see here, that's where she started with those eggs first. And those are the ones that were first to hatch. And then she'll go back in and lay new eggs in those cells. Here's some different colors of pollen. I'm always amazed at the different pollens that the bees are bringing in. There are charts available online that will tell you what that pollen source might be. I'm learning to be a better plant person, so I've learned to identify some of the pollens, but here's some nice frames with wonderful pollen stores in them. And again, they use the pollen to make bee bread to feed the larvae. Generally, around the brood area, there'll be a nice band of pollen, so it's just right there for them to feed the larvae. But sometimes we enter times of the year where there isn't enough pollen available to them, and so you can feed them a pollen substitute just to help get them through those tough times. The pollen substitutes stimulate the bees to create royal jelly, which is another food source for the larva. So I try to feed a little bit of extra pollen substitute in the fall, just so the bees that are feeding the larva, that will be the winter bees, will be able to make extra bee milk for them. There's some nice frames of nectar and some capped honey. And you can see in the picture on the left, different nectar sources produce different colored honeys. And I love how the bees have organized them here in very distinct sections of the comb. If the bees don't have enough honey to keep them alive, unfortunately, you have to feed them sugar syrup. And we hit the end of our nectar flow this year a little bit early, and so I'm already feeding some of my bees just so they don't starve to death. And then here are some different products. Of course, honey is everybody's favorite. I don't get a lot of honey. I keep more than 20 beehives, but there's always hives that need it. So if one colony makes extra, I will end up sharing that with another colony. So once in a while, I'll get a harvest, and when I do, it's really special. Propolis can also be harvested and used for medicinal purposes. You can make throat sprays with it or tinctures. You can add it to salves. It's medicinal for humans just as it is for bees. And then beeswax is amazing. Once you render it down and clean it, there's so many things that you can do with it. Candles, furniture polishes, balms, salves, lotions. It's just a really useful and ancient product that humans have been using for a long time. Okay, how am I on time?
You're doing fine.
Okay, great. Well, I'm here to answer any questions that you have.
I do have a question about honey. Is there a certain time of year when you harvest the honey, or is it like multiple times throughout the
You
year?
can do multiple harvests. Most beekeepers are harvesting their honey now. Most of them will do it in August and September. And then whatever else the bees can collect for the rest of the year, they'll keep for themselves. You can also harvest in the springtime because we do have a really strong nectar flow in the spring. But generally, beekeepers are harvesting in late summer, early fall.
And you said that you don't get a lot of honey. So do you keep bees basically because you think it's interesting and it's beneficial for the environment?
Yeah, and also as an educational, it's for education really, and my personal enjoyment. I really love having bees around, and I love working with them. It's always it's always a very invigorating and exciting experience to open up a hive and see what they're up to. And I kind of lean on the more conservation side, the more natural beekeeping side. And so I really think that the honey that they've worked so hard to forage is very sacred. And I feel guilty if I take very much.
That's very kind of you.
I even feel bad about watering my garden when there's bees foraging. I'm like, oh, I don't want to get anybody
Bethany, do you have any questions? Not to put you on the spot.
wet.
I don't really have any questions, but that was great. I learned a lot about bees. Thank
Oh,
you.
thank you. I know that was a lot of information and I probably talked really fast, but there's a lot to know when getting into bees. I would say, if anybody's interested in the Portland metro area, there are some really wonderful beekeeping associations. There's Portland Urban Beekeepers, there's Portland Metro Beekeepers, there's the Tualatin Valley Beekeepers Association, and each of those offers bee school every spring where you go and take classes to learn more about the nuts and bolts of beekeeping, and they offer ongoing meetings. Some clubs like Portland Urban Beekeepers offers a bee buddy program. It's sort of like a mentorship where you can have a more experienced beekeeper come out and help you if you need it. So there's lots of resources available that are very local because beekeeping is very local.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. That was really, really informative.
Thank you for having me.
All right.